all over the floor. We were covered in. We were also covered in flies, biting us constantly. Upon reaching Mindanao, we were forced to march 21 miles to Davao Penal Colony, which had previously been a prison for Filipino convicts. How we survived that march, that is, the ones that did, I still wonder. It seemed that every step would be our last one. We finally reached our destination. We're crowded into wooden buildings that were about 5 foot square for each man to sleep on. Of course, our bed was bare floor. They turned the Filipino convicts loose, but kept a few of them there to show us how to work. And the rest of them, I don't know what they did with them. The next morning, we were lined up and counted to see how many were alive. And then the Japanese commander came out to welcome us. The text of his welcoming address was something like this: "You are our eternal enemies. I hate you all. You have killed many Japanese. You attempted to thwart our building of a greater Asia. Our great army is marching on. We will defeat you and your country. At this very minute, our Navy is shelling your great cities of San Francisco, St. Louis, and Chicago." Then there was a snicker among us which made him more angry. "You do not believe me? No. Then I now will sentence you to 2 years of hard labor here on this penal farm. Your work uniform will be a G-string. You will be not permitted to wear anything else. Dismissed." The next day and following days thereafter, we went to work. At first it was not too bad, but like everything else, it went from bad to worse. The location of this place is right in the middle of a steaming jungle, almost under the equator. The heat was unbearable. When those Filipinos had been sentenced there before the war, they were able to bring their families with them, and they were assigned a house. But they couldn't get away because the 5,100 miles of jungle in every direction made it almost impossible to get through. But anyway, while we were there, the treatment was better. We managed to pull ourselves together by working on details on the outside of the prison fence. We could eat better. It wasn't because we were given more food. It's because we were finding more food on details and getting what was available to us and sneaking it in. We had to live and work under the most filthy conditions. Our daily routine was something like this: reveille, a roll call at 3:30 a.m., breakfast, steamed rice, a very small portion, then marched out of the prison gates to the farm. We usually arrived there a little after daybreak and went to work. It was all rice farming. We plowed the fields with water buffaloes and many times harrowed it with our own hands, using our fingers as harrowers' teeth. Sometimes we were hitched to the crude primitive farm tools and forced to pull them like horses. We were assigned so much work to do in one day, and we were kept there until the work was finished. Sometimes it would be after dark. Then we went back to our living quarters and a hard board for our bed. We were not permitted to wear our shoes. Our feet would be bleeding and swollen. The rice fields were hip deep in filthy, muddy water. The water would get so hot during the day that the steam would come up right in your face. We did that day in and day out, many, many days, over 2 years. You sort of learned while working how to take care of yourself. Anytime you had a chance to get a hold of anything else to eat, you took advantage of it. Now, we became quite experts at stealing food, and sometimes we talked to guards into letting us having some extra food, like papaya fruit growing on the outside, and bananas. We kept a little bit of it hidden on us each time we went out to work. Almost all of us were armed with knives hidden in our jean strings. The process we had when we were working, we usually grabbed pieces of metal we found and filed them down, sharpening them up, and that's how we made our own knives. We managed to steal enough food from the Japs to keep us going. We got to the point where we could eat anything. Raw frogs and roasted grasshoppers were a delicacy. Occasionally we would kill a nice big snake or lizard, but the greatest luck that would happen to any of us was for a dog to get into camp. There was usually a mad scramble to see which one of us could catch him first. The same thing with cats. In a few minutes, we would have them on a fire and a great feast was prepared. And believe it or not, I never ate anything that tasted so good in all my life. I remember one time when I was helping dig a ditch, some of the old convicts had been in there to raise some chickens. And sometimes these chickens would get inside the prison fence. On this day, we were digging this ditch and this old hen got into the prison yard. And I told my buddy, I'll keep an eye on the guard, and you do something like cut your foot a little bit and hop around like you're hurt real bad. You get that guard's attention and I'll get that chicken. Well, he did, and he started yelling and got the guard's attention. The guard went over to see what was the matter with him. I took my shovel and I hit the hen over its head as hard as I could. I had an old rag I kept around my shoulders to keep from getting sunburned, and I wrapped the hen up in this rag, and I dug out a little hole in the sand and buried it. I planned on later, when we were done with the work that day, I would come by and pick up that chicken and see if I could smuggle it into camp. Well, we went back to work. I looked out the corner of my eye, and there was a chicken had come too. It was jumping up and down in that sand, and the sand was going up and down. The guard walked right by it. I didn't know what to do. While the guard was looking the other way, I jumped out of formation and I started jumping up and down on this old hen, and it stopped. I went back to work, and later that afternoon, I went there and I scooped up the rag with the chicken in it and stuck it under my arm like it wasn't anything. We got to the gate. Of course, then they would search you. If they found anything on you, they would break both of your arms. And if I started to walk through the gate, and this little short guard came along with a big tropical helmet, I got in the middle between two men, with one on each side of me. When the guards got to me, I grabbed the rag and held it over his head. He checked my pants and walked to the next guy. I walked right on through the gate. Of course, I got the chicken in, but the next thing I had to do was figure out how to cook it. You can't imagine how deprived we were of everything, how valuable anything was. When you have nothing, we found some paper. Then one guy had a tin can. And of course, over several weeks that we had been there on these work details, we could bring in things like that. And everybody sort of had a monopoly on certain things. Someone brought in a tin can and he'd rent this can to you for a certain amount of the food. By the time I got the chicken, I had to find somebody who had other things. One guy had some charcoal, and I had to hire a couple of guys to guard the watch over us because you didn't want the Japs to see you while you were cooking. And by the time we got the chicken cooked, I had 9 men that participated in that meal. It was so good. In fact, it tasted like the best chicken I ever had in my life up to that time. There was another experience I had in getting extra food. The Japanese had picked up a lot of venereal disease, and they had gone to see American doctors who had sulfur drugs, but they were short on supplies, and they were always asking us if we had some sulfur drugs or where we could get some. And one of them one day asked me, "Can you get sulfur drug for me?" I said, "No, but I will try. What's one worth to you?" He said, "If you get me one, I'll give you a whole bucket of rice and fish." I said, "Well, I'll try." He said, "I'll be on the same detail tomorrow. Let me know." I said, "Okay." I went back in and talked to one of my buddies. He said, "I have a solution to that. I know a boy down here's got some foot powder. Let's make him a pill." So we set up a miniature pill making company, and we turned out a few decent looking pills. They even had the check mark on them and everything. And I took one out to him and gave it to him. And he gave me the bucket of rice and fish. And everything went really well for 3 or 4 weeks. I was getting a lot of friends because I had food to share. We were all gaining weight. I was the only one that had anything to eat. But one day he didn't show up. And it went on for several days he didn't show up. And I was getting a little bit hungry. And the guard replaced him. I asked him, "What happened to Hot Tie?" He replied, "He very sick. He in the hospital." Well, poor fellow, I felt so sorry for him. Any trick that you could play on them to get a hold of extra food, we did. I'm not going into all the details of things we did. I can talk all night and tell you more stories. We were there for 2.5 years. Men were always sick. Regardless of how high our fever was or how sick we were, we worked until we fell. Then the Japanese guards would come and beat you with clubs until they were satisfied you were sick. Sometimes these beatings result in broken legs and arms, or ribs, or even death. In this one particular camp, we had very few escapes, but there were times that somebody would escape, and they would pick out some guy and punish him, usually by a severe beating, by breaking both of his arms and legs. Usually the victim died within a couple days. Some of the Americans succeeded in escaping from this hell, and some were actually made it back home. One of my friends, Colonel William Edward Dias, got home and wrote a book about it. But we survived it. It wasn't long until we heard the Americans were landing at some of the islands south of us. And you want to know how we knew this? We had a fellow in our group who was an expert in radios, and he worked on the radios for the Japanese, and he would steal parts. And eventually he stole enough parts to make his own radio, and he did it very cleverly. He would hide the parts. He made the radio in the bottom of his canteen in a false bottom where it was hidden. The top of it held his water, and you couldn't tell the bottom of it had a radio. He always stood along one part of the south wall. Every night about 9:30, he could pick up a broadcast, and he turned it into the Voice of Freedom in Australia. And he got the news in English every night, and we knew what was going on all over the world. And that was certainly the biggest morale booster we had. And we got the news before the Japanese did. For example, when Italy surrendered, we got the news a day ahead of the Japanese. Now, when the Japanese got news like that, it was usually a month old. They had to go through the propaganda machine, and they delayed passing it down, especially if it was bad news. They heard us talking about it, but they didn't believe it. They thought we were just pulling the wool over their eyes about Italy surrendering. But 3 weeks later, they found out it was true. That made them very angry, thinking that something funny was going on here. They wanted to know how we knew about this 3 weeks ago. So one night they raided our barracks about midnight, made us all get out of bed. They stripped us down and made us stand at attention until daybreak. They went through everything there was in the prison camp looking for that radio because they knew we had one. And there it was, hanging on the wall right in front of them, and they never did find it. And we used that radio all the way up until the very end. Soon we found out the Americans were landing in the Philippines on Leyte. We got the news that night. We were so excited. You can't imagine how elated we were. The Japs decided we weren't going to be too happy about the news, so they decided to move us out ahead of the American invasion. We were tied hand and foot, then tied to each other and blindfolded, thrown into trucks, and taken 50 kilometers to the Davao Gulf, where we were crowded on another prison ship and taken back to Manila. From there, we were taken back to Cabanatuan, back to where we started 2.5 years ago. We were there for about just a few months, and things had gotten a little bit better for everybody because so many of the soldiers in that camp had died, and they were able to take care of many less prisoners. But then things began to get worse. Here we were kept for 2 months with a ration of 2 cups of thin rice water a day. All began losing weight and getting weak. During this time, the American forces had landed on Leyte and were bombing Luzon in preparation for an attack. The thousands of troops the skies were full of airplanes that Uncle Sam had promised us in Bataan were at last arriving, only 3 years too late for us. But they sure went on morale bursting skyward, or morale bursted hurled skywards. Everybody began to smile occasionally. We then believed that it was only a matter of time until we would be rescued. Little we know the fate that was in store for many of us. There were 3,650 of us that were still walking. About 1,000 were just so bedridden they could hardly be moved. On December 13th, 1944, we marched from Bilibid prison through the streets of Manila to Manila Bay. There, they were going to load us onto 2 ships and move us out on different days. These were later called the Hell ships. I was in the first group, and there was this other group. If you could trade places, you could. They would allow it. It so happens that most of my close and best friends were going in the second group. So I tried all night to get somebody from the second group to come over in the first group to trade places with me. But I couldn't find anybody that wanted to trade. Next morning, just as I was going to the gate to load onto the ship, I was just 20 steps from the gate. And once you passed the gate, there was no turning back. Then the one guy I knew from New Mexico asked me if I still wanted to trade. I said, yes, I do. I stepped out of line, and he stepped right into my place. He went right to the gate, and that was it. That ship was sunk by American bombers the next day, and everybody aboard was lost at sea. The Americans didn't know that American POWs were on that ship. It was like God was watching over me. Now, the ship that I went on was called the Orinoco Maru. It left Manila a few days later. In addition to the 1,850 prisoners, there were several thousand Japanese civilians on board the upper deck. It was a very big ship, one of the biggest passenger liners in the Japanese service. We were put in the bottom hold. It was very hot, very suffocating, and the air was really hot. In fact, we had almost no air at all, nothing, and almost immediately men began to faint from lack of air. We left that evening out of Lingayen Gulf in the middle of the night. The air was so bad, men were passing out. We were suffocating, plus we had no water, and men were fainting because of thirst. Now, I knew what it was like to travel on these ships because, like I told you before, I had done it. I knew what the situation was going to be like. So when I went on there, I had a canteen of water on me. Others didn't have any. I got over the corner, the bottom of the hold in a far, far corner. I knew that's where the air would be the best, and I lay down on the floor. But late that night, men started going crazy. Now, this is the part that's hard to believe and hard to tell, but it happened. Men were dying of suffocation and thirst. Many got panicky, and many more went completely crazy. Many of them had gone on board without carrying any water with them, and they were the first to become affected with this thirst craze. Some of them went so crazy that they cut the throats of men who were passed out, and also some of the fellow men, and sucked their blood. Many slashed their own wrists and drank their own blood. Many drank their own urine. All this added to the craze. Some committed suicide. Now these men had reached the breaking point and beyond. They could not help themselves. They didn't know what they were doing. At last the situation got so serious that those of us who had kept our heads were forced to kill the crazy. Knives and razors slashed through the air in an attempt to preserve our own life from the insane. This lasted until about 10 a.m. the next day, and thank God the American dive bombers bombed us again. They didn't know we were aboard. And one of the bombs came right into the hold. When it exploded, it threw men's arms, legs, blood, and intestines everywhere. It tore the sides of the ship open, but it did let in air, and it started letting water in. 3 of the bombs hit the ship. We could hear the screams of the women and children as the life was blown out of their bodies, but it did not arouse any feeling of sympathy within us. We also knew that our turn was coming next. All afternoon they kept up the attack and continuously struck the ship. Finally it caught a fire and they left us, and those who were still alive started to get out. There was only one rickety ladder for us to get out, with hundreds of men standing at the bottom of the ladder. There were about 800 or 900 of us killed, or about half of us. I looked at that ladder and the ship was on fire, and I thought there was no chance of making it, because there was too many of them climbing the same ladder. We were then met with machine gun fire and rifles from the Japanese guards left on board with us. We rushed them. Then followed a fierce hand-to-hand battle. We were using knives, razors, and clubs against machine guns and rifles. At last we overpowered the guards. There they burned up alive, as did many of the wounded Americans who could not get out. There was a steel beam that had dropped down in the center of the hold, but it was perpendicular to the wall and just barely leaning against it. I went to it, but I was so weak I could hardly stand up. I looked at that steel beam and I wondered if it was possible to climb it. I don't know where the energy came, but I climbed that beam like a squirrel. I didn't feel like I had a bit of weight. I didn't have much, and just a few minutes before, I was so weak I couldn't even hardly move. I got to the top and went over the side. We then jumped overboard and started swimming ashore. I found a bamboo pole, picked up two of my buddies who couldn't swim. We were lucky we were close to shore, but the Japs had machine guns set up waiting for us. The Japanese made sure that those of us who were heading to shore in one straight direction were let go. Those who swam in other directions were shot in the water. By the time we got to shore, there were 600 of the 1,850 of us left. We were immediately rounded up, for we were all too weak to offer any resistance. Everybody, before jumping overboard, had taken off most of their clothes, and some were absolutely nude. And this is where I lost Patrick Welch's dog tags. I couldn't help it. After we were all rounded up, we were put in a barbed wire enclosure. We were there for 3 days, plus the 2 days before leaving Manila, and were not given any food. On the 5th day, we were given 2 spoonfuls of raw, uncooked rice, and it tasted good. On the 6th day, we were given 4 spoonfuls of the same stuff. We had no way to cook it, so we ate it raw. Men were dying daily. We were taken up to a tennis court at San Fernando on the north shore of Luzon, where we were kept there for 8 straight days. And during those 8 days, we never had a bite of anything. And to get water, you had to get in line. And we stayed in line all the time, because by the time you got a drink, you got back in line because you were thirsty again. And you just kept getting in line and took your turn to get a drink. But out of one little stream of water, it was barely dribbling. After the 8th day, they brought in a truck with 2 sacks of uncooked rice, and they passed it out to us. Every man got about 2 teaspoonfuls. And in the afternoon, they loaded us on trucks and started moving us out on our way north. When the truck finally stopped, I looked out and saw some berries growing on the side of the road. I reached out and grabbed a handful of them. Everyone that was on that side of the truck reached out and grabbed a handful of these berries. And it turns out they were poisonous. And when we reached the destination that night, I was so sick and doubled up in cramps that I felt so bad that I didn't care if they shot me or what they did to me. I really didn't know what was going on. When we got to San Fernando jail, the jail yard, they put us in there for the night. All those who were just as sick as I was put off to one side. And the Japanese commander told our American commander, "These people will be taken back to Manila." I was conscious to know that that was what was going to happen. So I felt kind of pleased that I might be going back to Manila to a hospital. And I knew that Americans were landing there some 70 miles south of where we were. During the night, while I was passed out, a friend of mine came over and grabbed me over to his side. When I came to, I found out I was on the other side and I was going on ahead to Japan. And I wasn't going to get back to Manila to the hospital. I was very mad. Anyway, I found out after the war that all these men that were sick were taken out to the cemetery and they were all beheaded and thrown into a hole. Japanese officers that were responsible for that had his neck stretched after the war at a war crimes tribunal. And I believe God had saved me again. On Christmas Day, 1944, I was on a train, crammed into another hot railroad car. Remember, December, and this is summer there. It was